One more disclaimer, the information presented in this training is intended for educational purposes only and should not be considered a substitute for professional advice or clinical guidance. While we strive to provide accurate and up-to-date information, we cannot guarantee the completeness or accuracy of the content shared during this training. It is important to note that every educational institution and community may have unique policies, resources, and procedures regarding suicide prevention and intervention. We encourage you to consult with your school administration, mental health professionals, or relevant authorities to ensure that you are following the appropriate guidelines and protocols specific to your institution. Additionally, the content discussed during this training may address sensitive topics related to suicide, mental health, and crisis intervention. We recognize that these discussions may evoke strong emotions or personal experiences. We encourage you to prioritize your own well-being and seek support if needed. Remember that taking care of yourself is crucial in order to effectively support others. By participating in this training, you acknowledge and understand that the information presented is not intended to replace professional advice, and any actions taken based on the content are at your own discretion and responsibility. We highly recommend consulting with a mental health professional or other relevant experts for guidance tailored to your specific needs and circumstances. Thank you for understanding and participating. Now let's proceed with the training. As I get started with today's QPR training, I'd love to hear from everyone who is joining us. One interest that you have, something that you'd like to take away from today's training. One interest, maybe the reason why you attended, something about the topic itself. Maybe you heard about the training and it sparked some interest. I'd love to see what you're hoping to receive from the training or any interest that you have in this topic. Awesome. Student support, local support. Awesome. Awesome. We're definitely going to cover that. So as you're sharing in the chat, I'm going to continue. Anytime I provide this training, I think it's essential that I start off by sharing my own lived experience so you have an idea of who you're speaking to and who you're engaging with, and also that this training is not only classified as suicide prevention, but it's coming from the perspective of someone who has experienced mental health challenges and suicidal ideation. So I attended the University of West Florida in 2014. And I was a freshman there in college. I was the first in my family to go off to college, first in my family to leave home. And being 700 miles away from home, and also being on, in my mind, a large campus away from family and friends and things that were the norm for me, it was a very difficult experience. I was very excited about being a college student, but in addition to being a college student, I found myself having to work a full-time job because I had to pay rent. And I wanted to be involved in all of the things happening on campus. I was very ambitious, so I had very high expectations for myself. And it later led to me dealing with a mental health condition. At the time, I had no idea what mental health was. And it wasn't until I had a best friend of mine during that first year of college who recognized that something was going wrong with me. And she was bold enough to reach out and say something about it. The reason I use the word bold, number one, is very intentional that I say the word bold, because it does take courage to see something and say something. But the reason I use the word bold is because as you are engaging in the content of today's training, my hope is that you are empowered, you are equipped with the knowledge, information, and tools, so that if you're ever in a position where you see something, that you will feel confident and bold to say something. So my best friend reached out to me and she said, "Hey, what's going on? You know, I'm seeing these different things. You don't seem like yourself. You've been ignoring phone calls, text messages. You haven't been showing up to events. Is everything okay?" And as the happy-go-lucky person that I was, I tried to smile my way out of that conversation. I tried to dance around the obvious issue, but my best friend was not having it. And she wasn't leaving without an honest answer. And she was persistent in checking in with me until I finally gave in. And I told her everything that I was experiencing. I told her how I wasn't sleeping at night because I was having these negative racing thoughts. I told her how I didn't have any motivation to go anywhere, to do anything. I told her how I was having these really dark thoughts and it was keeping me in bed, and I was fearful that I may act on some of these dark thoughts. I told her how I wasn't eating. And as I'm sharing this information with my friend, I am so nervous about being honest because I had never done anything like that before. But this best friend, she listened. She gave me the space to share as much as I needed to share. And then she asked me a very important question. She said, "Hey, are you depressed?" And because I didn't understand what depression was at the time, I had no idea depression was a mood disorder. I thought depression, honestly, was a sign of weakness. And because I thought these things, I told her, "Of course I'm not depressed." She told me that everything I had described with her in that moment sounded like depression, and that there is a counseling center on campus and I could seek support and I didn't have to suffer in silence. I remember ending that conversation with her and I said, "Well, thank you for the information, but I'm good. I can handle this. I can figure this out. I'm not depressed. I'm all good." And about 2 weeks went by after that conversation, and I found myself in a desperate position. I was to the point where everything that I was using to cope with the feelings and emotions that I was experiencing, it was no longer working. I tried praying my way through it, and I would go to sleep, wake up still depressed. I tried drinking my way through it, and I would drink, and then I'd feel something, I'd feel a buzz, and then I would experience those same feelings of depression. I tried smoking my way through it. I tried all of these different vices that, in all honesty, wasn't helping the situation. And I made up in my mind, well, what's the worst that can happen? I ended up going to the counseling center. I sat down with a psychiatrist for the first time ever in my life. And to my knowledge, it was the first time anyone in my family had ever spoken to a mental health professional. But I was desperate enough to try something different. I sat down with this psychiatrist. I did an assessment. I answered all her questions, and I was diagnosed with major depressive disorder. So after receiving this information, everything started to make sense. Everything was now clicking because as this doctor was explaining to me the signs and symptoms of depression, it helped me to realize that this is what I was going through, but that also I can get treated and I can get well. I don't have to suffer in silence. I don't have to experience this day in and day out. And so I got committed to this treatment plan. Fast forward 4 or 5 years later, still working through recovery, still following a treatment plan, going through the ebbs and flows of depression and dark thoughts and suicidal ideation. And one of the things that I'm grateful for to this day about this entire experience that I had was that my best friend was bold enough to see something and say something. Throughout this presentation, I'm going to share some very difficult concepts, ideas, but my hope is, again, that you will be encouraged and feel empowered to have these necessary conversations. If you'd like to share in the chat, I'd love to see if anyone here has attended a gatekeeper training or a suicide prevention training ever before. You can just put a 1 in the chat if you have. You can put a 0 in the chat if you have never attended a gatekeeper training or suicide prevention training before. So I'm not familiar with the Gatekeeper GGC Club. It may be the same if it's by QPR Institute. If it is not, then it'll be two different things. So I see we have a mix of individuals. Zero. Okay, Gatekeeper Ministries. No, I don't think it's the same thing. Thanks for sharing that, Cass. All right, so we have a mix in here. So also feel free to engage throughout the training. If you have any questions, I do want you to feel comfortable with coming off mute or sharing them in the chat. I do have the chat right next to me, so I'm able to see your questions as they come in. Although this is not in person, I'd like to keep it as close to in person as we can, keep it as engaging as possible. So feel free to jump out if you have any specific questions or comments or suggestions or any thoughts as we're going through the training. Just remember that this is being recorded, so that you have awareness of that. And then if you'd like to save your questions at the end for when we stop the recording, feel free to do so as well. Some of the objectives from this training, you're going to be able to recognize when someone is at risk for suicide. You're going to be able to identify those specific warning signs of suicide, how to intervene if someone is in crisis, how to refer someone to appropriate resources, and also how to get yourself or others support and how to learn to prevent suicide. I do these trainings and I do presentations throughout the country. And one thing that I find very typical as I'm speaking to students, faculty, staff members at different colleges and universities is that we have much more in common than what we have different. And one of the commonalities that we share is the stigma, the self-stigma, the social stigma associated with mental health and also suicide. So when I ask the question of, hey, what makes it difficult to ask for help? Why is it so challenging that when we know we have a psychological, mental, or emotional challenge, we're less likely to open up and seek support? And I oftentimes hear things like, hey, I don't want to be a burden. Everyone else has their own issues. They have their own things that they're working on, and I don't want to add additional stress to that. I don't want to be seen as weak, right? I tried, asking for help. I saw a counselor before and I had a bad experience, and I don't want to feel that again. Anyone in here ever experienced any of these, or you've heard any of these before? It's very, very, very common. So when we're talking about QPR, what is the purpose of QPR? First of all, QPR stands for Question, Persuade, Refer. It's a training by the QPR Institute. QPR is not intended to be a form of counseling or treatment, but QPR is intended to offer hope through positive action. So as you're receiving this information, you're not being equipped to be a counselor or a social worker, and that is not the expectation. The expectation is that you'll learn these practical tools and strategies to help you to encourage someone to seek support if they're at risk for suicide. Now, we can't talk about suicide without talking about the myths, the misconceptions about suicide. Would anyone like to come off of mute and share some of the myths or misconceptions that you've heard about suicide? Or if you'd like, you can share it in the chat as well. As you're thinking about it, I'll give you some time to think about it. I'll share a few myths and misconceptions. Number one, talking to or asking someone if they're having suicidal thoughts may trigger the act. Anyone ever heard that one? Hey, we shouldn't talk about it, because if you talk about it, then you're going to encourage someone to complete suicide. The fact is actually that asking individuals who are at risk for suicide, when you ask them, it can help to lower the anxiety. It can open up communication, and it can lower the risk of an impulsive act. when we talk to the person, it helps to help them determine, or it helps us to determine whether or not he or she is considering suicide. So it's very important to note with this myth is that the reason why many individuals are at risk for suicide is not necessarily that they want to die, they want to kill themselves, but there's an underlying issue that convinces the individual that suicide is the best option. And when we talk about suicide, encourage the conversation, it helps us to get to the root of the issue. Another myth is that young people never think about suicide because they have their entire life ahead of them. This is a huge misconception. Huge. It's crazy, right? Suicide is the second leading cause among young people. 14, I believe it's 14 to 34 years old, right? So suicide does not discriminate. Whether someone has their entire life ahead of them or not does not mean they don't experience difficult challenges that causes them to believe that taking their life is the best option. All right, so it's actually 15 to 24 is the second leading cause of death among these individuals. Sometimes children under 10 years old die by suicide. And what oftentimes happens is that we hear these individuals share specific clues and we see these specific warning signs and we say, oh, they're just going through a phase. They'll get over it. They're just young. Don't listen to them, right? But what you'll learn in this training is that it's very important to take all signs seriously, and we'll go through that as well. Another myth is that there's really nothing you can do to help someone who is truly suicidal. This is a huge myth. The fact is that most people who are suicidal, like I mentioned, they don't want to die. They don't want to die, right? They just want to feel better. They want to end the psychological pain. They don't want to end their lives. But when life is so difficult, the emotional pain is so severe, the psychological pain is so strong. For the individual at risk for suicide, suicide seems like the best option to end the pain. So what do we do about it? How can we help, right? If we know that there are misconceptions about suicide, there are myths about suicide, and we know that a lot of these myths are causing us to shy away from the conversation, how can we start to have these conversations? And I believe the first thing is to know the different clues, to know the different warning signs. All right, so I'm going to go over some specific clues that you can look out for and warning signs that we can speak to rather than the suicidal ideation itself or the suicidal act itself. The other thing that we can do is to take all signs seriously. The more clues and signs we observe, the greater the risk. You'll also find that there are different types of clues. There are different types of warning signs that we're going to go more in depth with. So what are the clues? There are direct verbal clues. There are indirect verbal clues. There are behavioral clues. And there are situational clues. Now, speaking of direct verbal clues, these are statements that someone who is suicidal will say that is a clue to let us know that they're thinking about suicide, right? They're having these dark thoughts. So if they're saying something like, I've decided to kill myself, that's a direct verbal clue. I wish I were dead. I'm going to commit suicide. I'm going to end it all. If such and such doesn't happen, I'll kill myself. And when we're talking about the school setting, and for a moment, We'll touch specifically on GGC. GGC has a large student athlete population. And what we know through the media and statistics is that student athletes are at high risk for suicide. So if someone devotes their entire life, starting middle school or even younger than that, to play a sport, on the collegiate level, and hopefully play at the professional level, and they experience a career-ending injury, this individual's identity is wrapped up in their ability to play this sport. So in their minds, oftentimes, it only makes sense that if I can no longer play this sport, my life is no longer worth living. So that's how we make it practical, right? There are specific things that we can hear, specific things that people will say where we should take these clues very seriously. Now let's talk about indirect verbal clues. Now, the difference between direct and indirect is that indirect verbal clues are statements that will be said that wouldn't necessarily allude to this individual completing suicide, but it gives a hint that they may be thinking about it. So you'll hear things like, I'm tired of life. I just can't go on. My family would be better off without me. Who cares if I'm dead anyway? I just want out. I won't be around much longer. Pretty soon, you won't have to worry about me. Is there anyone here in the training that you've heard any of these statements, whether direct or indirect verbal clues? Maybe a peer, colleague, another student?
Yes, previous history.
Previous history.
Yeah, not at GGC so far.
Got you. Thank you for sharing. So I see yeses. So all of us, and I have as well, we hear these certain things, and I'll share my own personal experience. The first time I attended a suicide prevention training, I was in undergrad. And I'm telling you the honest truth. Like, I went to this training and I heard the trainer saying the word suicide. And I honestly couldn't even say the word. It was such a dissociation that I wasn't able to even say suicide. And it was a training just like this, where they were encouraging us, empowering us with the tools to speak on things like suicide. But because I had never had those types of conversations before, it was very difficult. And so it's very important to also recognize, for many people, when we hear these direct or indirect clues, sometimes it's challenging to say something about it. Sometimes it's difficult to hear these things and respond in a way where we're showing empathy, where we're listening intently, where we're listening for those clues, where we're actively referring someone to services and support. So when we talk about clues, there are also clues that the individual won't necessarily say, but they may do, right? Maybe a previous suicide attempt, acquiring a gun, or any other types of weapons, or stockpiling pills. Maybe co-occurring depression, moodiness, hopelessness. My example, like I shared earlier, of being diagnosed with major depressive disorder, after receiving that diagnosis and starting in treatment, everything didn't go well, right? Things got really bad before they got better. And when things were really bad, I was having these thoughts of taking my life, right? So co-occurring depression, co-occurring illnesses. If this individual is putting personal affairs in order, maybe they're calling friends and, saying their goodbyes. If they're giving away prized possessions, This can look like maybe having a game system, and this individual, we know loves to play video games or whatever the case is, and now they're giving away these things that they place a lot of value in. These are signs. A sudden interest or disinterest in religion. And so I want to break this one down just a little bit. Oftentimes when someone is thinking about suicide, for many people, they have this idea of an afterlife. So for someone to have a sudden interest in religion and they're suicidal, the idea is that when I kill myself, I will be able to have, this great afterlife, right? It's a real thought. It's a real thing that many people experience. And then a sudden disinterest in religion, maybe this individual has their hope and their faith in whether it's God or some other deity, and they believe that God or this deity has left them alone, right? Is no longer with them, is no longer helping them. They may disregard their religion because they've lost all hope, right? And these are signs that we can look out for. Drug or alcohol abuse, maybe relapse after a period of recovery, can be a behavioral clue. And then unexplained anger, aggression, and irritability. I want to pause for just a moment. If anyone in the training has any other behavioral clues that maybe you've seen, you've experienced, that you'd like to share with everyone. Got it. Got you, Cash. All right, so let's talk about some more clues. So situational clues. So this specifically is referring to an event or an experience that happens that leads someone to believe that suicide is the best option. So being fired or expelled from school. A recent unwanted move, having to leave. I know one thing, when the pandemic happened, COVID-19, there were a lot of schools, specifically colleges and universities, that were shut down. And for many people, I know in Florida where I live, for many people, they had to go back to whether it was their country, they had to go back to their home, however far it was, but they had to leave school because everything was now being shut down. Again, going back to the point of someone working their entire lives, right, to pursue higher education, to pursue any education. And now they're having to move, they're having to leave that dream. Loss of any major relationship, right? This can be whether girlfriend, boyfriend, husband, spouse, whatever that relationship is. It can even be whether it's a therapist that this individual developed a great relationship with. It can be a friend, right? Loss of that major relationship. And it doesn't even have to be by death, right? It can be maybe this individual, is no longer in good terms with someone, and they no longer have this relationship that meant so much to them. Diagnosis of a serious or terminal illness. Sudden unexpected loss of freedom or fear of punishment. Maybe anticipated loss of financial security. I mentioned earlier losing a cherished therapist, a counselor, a teacher, someone who is meaningful to that individual. Or as I mentioned earlier, the fear of becoming a burden to others. So these are specific things that will happen that can possibly lead someone to think about killing themselves. So what do we do when we see these things? How do we respond to these different clues? How is it that we can develop the courage and the ability to know what to say, how to say it, when to say it, and when it's appropriate? I want to share a quick video with you, and I want you to listen for what you heard is most important in this video.
I'm 220 feet in the air, and I have somebody trying to get my attention. I keep yelling at him. I say, if you get any closer, that's it. Because all I got to do is nudge.
Can you give me a thumbs up if you can hear the volume? Okay, cool. Thank you.
Nudge back.
And what happens? Because somebody is 4 or 5 minutes late getting home, they roll down their window as they come by, and they yell out, "Jump, you SOB!" What could I have done different?
I was tired of living this lie. I was tired of lying to everybody. I was exhausted at who I become. I thought about the Golden Gate Bridge. I asked for directions. So I got to the Bay Bridge, and I asked them for directions. I said, how do you get to the Golden Gate Bridge? But I was telling myself, okay, whoever I ask, I hope that when I ask them, they'll look me in my face, and they'll see something inside of me and ask me, well, why are you going to the bridge? Because part of me on the inside was ready to say why I wanted to go. I mean, I was really looking for a reason to continue to live. I couldn't find anything. And the lady just looked at me in my face and gave me a plain look. She gave me directions. I knew it wasn't gonna be all right no more. Parked my car, left the keys in the ignition, grabbed my prepaid phone, and I got there on that bridge and I started walking. I looked over the railing, saw there was nothing that was going to stop me. I saw there was nothing in water. But when I looked in that water, I just didn't see water. I saw peace. I saw no more nights of crying. I saw no more living a lie. I saw no more being a burden. All the things that I needed in life, I saw in that water. I took a couple steps back, and in the moment as I'm heading towards the railing and about to jump over, I hear a voice. Hey, is everything all right? And in that moment, it was enough of a distraction to where I grabbed the railing and turned myself on this cord. I'm 220 feet in the air, and I have somebody trying to get my attention. I'm upset. I'm yelling back and forth for him. Stay back. I'm trying to keep myself warm. I'm bundled up. So I keep yelling at him. I say, if you get any closer, that's it. Because all I got to do is nudge back. Like, that's all not even a big nudge, just a small nudge, and that's it. Finally, in my heart starts feeling like, why does he even care? Because he's not yelling at me. He's not making me feel like I'm stupid for being here. Because everything inside of me is like, man, you're stupid. You didn't put yourself in this position. You did not come here to talk. I came here because I was in pain and I was trying to get out of it. But here, after 15 minutes, this voice starts to penetrate me in my soul, and it gets a little closer, and I start to hear him. I never look up, and in that same position on that bridge, with my feet hanging off the cord, and at any moment I could do this and it could be over. And for 92 minutes, this individual, this human, just listened to me. Now, think about that when I say that. For 92 minutes, he sat there, he stood there, and just listened to me.
So after this time, he decided on his own to come back over the rail. And I said, what did I do that helped this situation? All he told me was, you listened. You let me speak and you listened. That's all this guy was looking for, and I think that's what so many people are looking for. Shortly after this incident, I received a letter from Kevin's mother. Dear Mr. Briggs, I adopted Kevin when he was only 6 months old, but you are one of the reasons Kevin is still with us. I truly believe Kevin was crying out for help. We truly thank God for you. Sincerely indebted to you, Narvella Berthia. It's really good. We have a choice. Are we going to take the path of none of my business, they should handle it? Or are we going to confront them head on and say, hey, I'm seeing these things. What's going on? Let's talk. Listen to understand. That's the key. Listen to understand.
Kevin Briggs is known as the guardian of the Golden Gate Bridge. He spent more than 2 decades talking people down from committing suicide.
I want them to know that there is hope, and we want to help. We want to know about it. Don't feel that you're alone in this.
Briggs talked roughly 200 people out of suicide.
We don't have to be doctors, psychiatrists, and all that. We can do this right here, right now, to be able to have that courageous conversation with someone.
I just focus on going this way. I don't worry about going back. I don't worry about left, I don't worry about right, I just worry about forward. I used to think I was alone and nobody in the world felt like me. Now that I know it's people in the world that feel like me, it's my job to help them out, to encourage them, let them know, hey, I've been where you've been. The darkest point that you ever thought you could ever be, and I came out of it. You can come out of it too. I can't honestly believe that with almost 8 billion people on this planet, that people still feel alone. And that's why we all gotta come together. 2 ears and 1 heart. That's what saved my life, and that's what all of us in this room possess. Challenge yourself today and in the future to look out for each other. The moment people feel heard, they get healed. The moment. But they have to be heard. Listening can save people's lives, and we all can do it.
Would anyone like to share what you took away from watching that clip? I see you, Cass. You can go ahead.
Actually, one of the most powerful things I saw there is in a world population of 8 billion people, how does anyone feel alone? And that's huge. I mean, there are other important factors, important facts in there, but that I've never heard someone phrase it like that.
Thank you for sharing. I see in the chat, it's important to say something if you see something. Absolutely. Thank you for sharing. So when we talk about seeing something and then saying something, the question then becomes, how do we do it? How do we ask the question? What if all of these clues that we talked about, verbal, behavioral, and situational, we're checking all the boxes. We're seeing these clues. What do we do? How do we do it? So I want to talk about that. There are some tips that I want to share with you on asking the suicide question. The first is, if you're ever in doubt, don't wait. Ask the question. If there's ever any thought in your mind that this person could potentially be thinking about suicide, don't wait. Again, it goes back to the myth that we spoke of. When we talk about suicide, it encourages someone to take their life. But in actuality, what it does is it opens up a safe space for the conversation. And if the person is not suicidal, they will say, I'm not thinking about suicide. And if they are suicidal, whether they choose to share with you or not, at least they know that you are a safe person to share with whenever they're ready. So don't wait. The other tip is, if the person is reluctant, be persistent. All right. And this absolutely has everything to do with the level of closeness that you have with this individual, depending on where the relationship is. For me, the example that I shared, the reason why my friend was able to be as persistent as she was is because we were good friends. She knew me well enough to know when things were not going well. And so it was a little bit easier for her to be persistent. right? So this definitely has to do with the level of relationship with the individual. Another tip is to talk to the person alone in a private setting. I love the share that we just heard. If there are, I believe it was 8 billion people, like I find it hard to believe that, we're not alone. Right? And so if that is the case, and we also know that it's difficult for people to talk about suicide, then it's critically important that we create a space or a setting that's private where this individual feels that they can share as much or as little as they want. So if you're having the conversation, you don't want to be in Starbucks, right? Where there's people that can be listening. You don't want to be in a classroom where there are other students, there are other peers. You want to be in a setting where this individual knows that, hey, I can share whatever I need to share, and it's going to stay, in this conversation. Another thing is to allow the person to talk freely. I don't know if anyone has this issue. I know I do, where I think I'm addicted to solving problems. Anybody else? Or is it just is it just me? I just want to solve all the problems, right? And so as soon as I find an opportunity to share a solution, I'm just butting into the conversation, right? But when someone is thinking about suicide, more times than not, they're not looking for you to solve the problem. We just heard in the video, they want someone to listen to understand. And when we're able to understand, we're able to learn how to communicate with this individual. So allowing the person to talk freely tells us that we take a step back and we give this individual the space to share. Another tip is to give yourself plenty of time. I'm going to go into specific ways that we can ask the question, and this will tie really well into this part here. But giving yourself plenty of time means that you don't want to be in a rush. If this individual does say, hey, I am thinking about suicide, you don't want to be worrying about, when class starts and you have to jet to catch the class, right? You want to give yourself plenty of time to know that if in fact this person is thinking about suicide, you can spend as much time as they need to talk, right? So being mindful, having this conversation does take some intentionality. So being mindful of that in having the conversation. Another tip is to have the resources handy. So I'm going to share some resources with you by the end of the training, but some resources to be mindful of is the Suicide and Crisis Lifeline, which is 988. Anyone can call or text 988 and get immediate support. It's 24/7 access to a crisis counselor, and anyone, whether they're thinking about suicide or not, and they just need someone to talk to, they can call or text 988 and get immediate support for free. As I mentioned, I'm going to share some additional resources along with resources at GGC that are local to your community. So I'll share that at the end of the training as well. Remember, how you ask the question is less important than asking the question. Sometimes there's some fear, there's some nervousness around, what if I say the wrong thing? What if I don't say it right? What if I mention something and it elicits a certain response? Remember, how you ask the question is less important than asking the question. So QPR Institute offers a 3-step intervention plan. There are different ways that you can ask the question. So the first part is to identify, recognize some of those clues and warning signs. Would anyone like to share? We talked about some of the clues and warning signs. What are some of the clues and or warning signs that we can look out for? You can either come off of mute or you can share in the chat that we've already discussed. I see your hand, Cass. Feel free to come on.
Self-harm.
Say it again.
Self-harm.
Self-harm. Got it. Thank you. And if you'd like, you can also share it in the chat. I'll be happy to read it for you. So let's take the example of self-harm, right? A less direct approach of asking the question. Maybe we see, right? We see the scars, right? One less direct approach to asking the suicide question is, hey, I've recognized that you have, some marks on your arm, your leg, your body, wherever you see those marks. And I'm wondering if you're doing okay. Is everything okay? Right? So that's a less direct approach to asking the question. And we may use that approach if we don't have an established relationship with this person yet. Or maybe we're not comfortable with asking a more direct question. Right? We can also say things like, hey, have you been unhappy lately? You don't seem like yourself lately. Is there something going on? Have you been so sad lately that you've been thinking about ending your life? Do you ever wish you could go to sleep and never wake up? So if you haven't noticed, one thing that is common with all of these less direct approaches to asking the suicide question is that it is open-ended, right? And asking this question or any of these questions or any question that you decide to ask, it doesn't have to be these specific questions. You want to ensure that it gives the individual an opportunity to share, right? We're so used to asking yes or no questions, right? A question where the two responses that are easiest is yes or no, right? But how can we be a little bit more intentional with the question so that it elicits a thoughtful response? Because the goal is to get to what is bothering or what is challenging for that individual. Because again, we talked about suicide isn't what the individual wants to do. They don't want to end their life. They want to end the pain. So in asking these questions, we're looking for the root of the pain. Now, there are also direct approaches, very direct approaches. Would anyone like to maybe share an example of a direct approach for asking the suicide question? An example of what you think a direct approach may be. I see your hand, Cass. Go ahead.
All right, I'm still getting used to that.
Okay.
Direct approach we've seen in the past is recognizing that their alcohol or drug usage has intensified. Not from a point of shame, but just kindly noticing.
Yeah. 100%. That's so good. Thanks for sharing. Yeah, and feel free if you have another example that anyone would like to share in the chat, feel free to share that and I'll be happy to share it. I see we had a few responses to the previous question about clues. So wrapping up personal affairs, absolutely, right? And these are, that's an example of a behavioral clue. And then we see another example, noticing them withdraw from their normal behavior, talking less, being socially withdrawn. This is one that many college students exhibit. And it's a very quick way that we can bring awareness to a behavior and speak specifically to that behavior, which then helps us to have the conversation. So direct approaches to the suicide question. First way is, we can say, hey, when people are as upset as you seem to be, they sometimes wish they were dead. I'm wondering if you're feeling that way too. And what this question does is it normalizes the feeling. It normalizes the individual's experience. Like, hey, you're not alone. There are other people who have felt and experienced some of the things that you've experienced. I'm wondering if you're feeling that way. Another example is, hey, I've noticed some changes in your behavior. I love the example that we just heard about substance and or drug abuse, right? I'm noticing some changes, right? You're drinking a little bit more than you typically drink. You're engaging in drugs, and I don't normally see you do those things, or you haven't done it in a while. I wonder if you're having suicidal thoughts. Or we can say, hey, are you thinking about killing yourself? Are you thinking about taking your life? Are you thinking about suicide? And if anyone in this training right now, maybe you've worked in sales or you've done any marketing or something like that, we know that, hey, when you ask for the sale, what's the first thing that we should do once we ask for the sale? So for example, hey, I have this cell phone, iPhone 14, would you like to buy? So the first thing that if you've ever worked in sales, you're taught to shut up, let the person talk. But oftentimes what happens is we go for the sale and then we end up talking ourselves out of the sale because we're like, okay, well, if you don't have this, well, I can bring it down to this, or I can do this. And hey, you don't really have to pay me all of this. You can give me that, you can do. And it's the same thing in asking the suicide question. When we ask the question, be quiet. And sometimes that awkward silence can be awkward. And more times than not, that's the best thing that we can do for an individual who is thinking about suicide. Because not only are they given the opportunity to process the thoughts that they're having and how they choose to respond, but now they also know that you're willing to sit with them in the silence because you care that much. Again, it goes back to, hey, we're not trying to solve the problem. The goal is to listen, to understand. The goal is to have a conversation. I see in the chat. That is an interesting framing, the sales pitch. Yeah, I mean, it's relevant, right? And if we understand that the quiet, the pause, the stillness is what helps us to facilitate a meaningful conversation, then we can help individuals when they're having these dark thoughts. If you can't ask the question, find someone who can. So there are going to be situations and circumstances where you're unable to ask the question. Maybe you're not near the individual geographically, right? Maybe you don't have the individual's phone number, or you don't have a means to contact this individual. Maybe you are nervous about asking the question. You don't feel comfortable. Maybe you don't have a relationship with this person to ask the question. Find someone who can, right? And this goes to the point of establishing and helping the individual to establish a solid support system, which we're going to talk about a little bit further on. So I know I mentioned it's less important how you ask the question than asking the question itself, but I also want to go over some ways on how not to ask the question, because that's also a thing. All right, so how not to ask the question. You're not thinking of killing yourself, are you? You wouldn't do anything stupid, would you? Suicide is a dumb idea. Surely you're not thinking about suicide. Don't worry, I won't tell anyone. Your secret is safe with me. I'd love for someone to either come off of mute or share in the chat. Why is it that we don't want to ask the question in this way? What is something that's common in all of these questions? I see in the chat, thank you for sharing. All shaming framing, absolutely. They come off very judgmental, 100%, very judgmental. What do you think someone is going to say, whether they are suicidal or not? What do you think someone is going to say if you ask them, you wouldn't do anything stupid, would you? They're going to say, of course not. Right? Of course I'm not going to kill myself. Are you crazy? Knowing that in their minds, that's the only thing that floods their minds at night, right? But because the space that you've created is full of judgment, full of shame, they're not going to respond and be honest with you in that question, right? These questions could make that person feel more alone than they already do. Absolutely. Feel more alone. Feel like they're the only ones going through it. And here's the thing. Not only the feelings of that individual, but in asking any of these questions, you have now categorized yourself as an unsafe person. Whether you meant to do it or not, whether it was an impulse or not, you didn't really mean what you were saying. But when this person heard that, what they thought to themselves, or what they may think to themselves, is, I can never talk to that person about this, even if I am considering it, because that's the way they think about someone who is suicidal. Right. And I want to address this last one. Don't worry, I won't tell anyone. Your secret is safe with me. We never want to say that statement because we have a responsibility to report if someone is suicidal, if we have any inclination that they may kill themselves. Right. And so you never want to say your secret is safe with me, because if they're ever in a position where you do have to share to help save their lives, you don't want to tarnish that relationship. Right. So the goal is to get them help. The goal is to ensure that they stay alive, whether that is sharing that information with someone or not. Right. So we want to refrain from shaming framing. We want to refrain from being judgmental. We want to refrain from asking questions where the person can say yes or no, and then it just ends the conversation, right? We want to be open-ended in the questions that we ask. So we talked about asking the question. So the Q in QPR is question, asking the question. And then we move on to P, which is to persuade someone to stay alive. How do we persuade someone to stay alive? Number one, we can listen. Listen to and for the problem. You want to give this individual your full attention. If you're having a conversation with them and it's possible for you to turn your phone off and put it in another room or whatever the case is, you want to help them to recognize that you are with them in that moment. Full attention. You're not looking at your watch to check the time. You're not looking at the clock. You're not looking at the TV, right? You want to cut off all distractions, because in this moment, this individual is sharing something that is intimate to them, sharing something that is honest and vulnerable for them. And you never want them to feel as if you don't care, right? So by listening to and for the problem, and also giving them your full attention, you're speaking without even saying, you're speaking that I'm here with you. The other thing to remember, and I've said this a few times so far throughout the training, is to remember that suicide is not the problem. Oftentimes when someone speaks of suicide, the first thought or reaction is that the problem is suicide. But in reality, suicide is not the problem. It's the solution to a perceived unsolvable problem. And in listening and giving full attention and asking open-ended questions, the goal is to get to the root of that perceived unsolvable problem. For many people, and I've experienced this, where unfortunately and fortunately, there have been multiple people where I've had to ask the suicide question, and I've had to go in depth in these questions to help support this individual. And more times than not, in having this conversation and asking these very intimate questions, I realize that there is a perceived unsolvable problem. One example I'll give you. I was talking to a young lady, and she was completely convinced that suicide would be the best decision for her. And on the outside looking in, you look at this young lady and it seems as if she has a great life, right? She's smiling, she's engaging with friends, she's posting on social media, she's doing all these things. And then we have this conversation where she's convinced that suicide is the best option. So I'm having the conversation, I'm asking certain questions, I'm listening to and for the problem. And in asking the question, I realized that this individual, this young lady, she knows exactly how she's going to kill herself. She has the means, she knows how she's going to do it. And she also knows when she's going to do it. So in my mind, because of the work that I've been able to do around suicide prevention and engaging in these types of conversations, I now start to ask more questions. Because unfortunately, I wasn't in a position geographically where I can just go to this person and sit with them, right? We were, hundreds of miles away from each other. And so I started to ask more questions. And long story short, we were able to get to the root of the problem. The root of the problem, which was that no one understands how I feel. And the person that I love the most, my mom, right? And I'm speaking like I'm the young lady. She was like, my mom, the person I love the most, my mom doesn't know and doesn't care how I feel. And just because I was an individual who allowed this young lady to feel and know that I understood what she was experiencing and I cared, this young lady made a decision by herself to give, and I'm not going to go into details about the means of how she was going to take her life, but she gave this thing to a trusted guardian. And she told this trusted guardian, this is what I've been thinking about. This was my plan, and I need help. So in one conversation, because I was persistent and I continued to ask questions and I continued to listen, this individual made a decision by themselves not to take their life, not to take her life. So suicide is not the problem. It's a solution to a perceived unsolvable problem. And if we can get to the root of the problem, then we can help the individual to see that suicide is not the best option. We heard this one already, right? Do not rush to judgment. In persuading someone to stay alive, we don't want to make them feel bad for the way they feel, right? Their feelings are valid. And then we want to offer hope in any form. We heard from the video, the way the guy who was on the bridge and who was determined to jump from the bridge and take his life, the way he received hope was that the officer listened. The officer asked questions. And that's how we can offer hope. Another way is we can take that person to support services. We can call the crisis lifeline with that individual to let them know that we're here for them, right? We care for them. But in whatever way, in whatever form that we can, it's essential to offer hope. Right? So once we do all of those things, how do we engage through questions? Right? You can say something like, hey, will you go with me to get help? Will you let me help you get help? What can we do to keep you safe for now? And one thing I want to point out in the last question is the word we. As we're having this conversation with someone who is at risk for suicide, who is thinking about ending their life, it's critically important that we remind them that they're not alone. That even though the thoughts, the feelings, the emotions, they're all pointing to them being alone, being by themselves, and that no one understands what they're going through, we want to remind them, hey, we're in this together, right? Will you go with me to get help? Because I'm willing to drop what I need to drop, right? And go to the counseling center, go to the hospital, whatever the case is. When someone is suicidal, they often believe that they can't be helped, right? At the point where they're thinking about suicide, more times than not, they've lost hope. They feel helpless. They feel like they've tried everything and nothing works. And so as the individual who is a gatekeeper, you may have to do more. You may have to step outside of yourself, try a little bit harder, right? You may have to do more, say more, ask more in order to support this individual, because more times than not, they've lost hope. So what are some ways that we can refer? So we've talked about the Q in QPR, which is the question. We've talked about the P, which is persuade. Now let's talk about referring someone to support services. How do we refer them? So before we dive into how we refer them, there are a couple of options, right? There's the best referral option, which involves taking the person directly to someone who can help. So for example, let's say you have a peer, there's another student, anyone on the campus who you're noticing all these signs, right? All the clues that we mentioned, they're checking all the boxes, right? And you have this conversation with them and they're thinking about suicide, or maybe they're not thinking about suicide. Maybe you recognize that they just need someone to talk to. The best referral is to say, hey, I know we got a counseling center on campus. And as a matter of fact, you already pay for it, right? And your tuition. So you don't have to pay any additional fees, right? These are the hours. How about we walk together to the counseling center? That's the best referral option. Now, the next best referral is getting a commitment from them to accept help, then making the arrangements to get that help. So what this can look like is simply, hey, I've noticed that you've been withdrawing from your friends. You've been isolating yourself, and I really care about you. I really want to see you get back to yourself again. I'm noticing all of these signs and it's pointing to XYZ. I really want you to accept help. Hey, we have a counseling center on campus. Here are the hours. This is the number. Can you reach out to the counseling center and schedule an appointment? Can you promise me to do that? Right? And in getting that commitment, not only do you want to get that commitment, but you want to follow up. Hey, I'm going to follow up in 2 days, right? Because I care so much about you. I'm going to follow up, and then I want you to share with me when that appointment is, what day, what time. And I want to call you after you have that appointment to hear how it went. And you can share as much or as little as you like, but the reason is because I care about you, right? So that's the next best referral. Maybe you're not able to walk that person to the counseling center, but you can get a commitment and you can follow up on that commitment. And the third best referral ties into the second one. The third best is to share resources, right? I mentioned the Suicide and Crisis Lifeline, the 988 number. I'm also going to share some other GGC resources at the end of the training, national, local resources. You share those resources, whether it's through a text or you're having a conversation with this person, and then your goal is to get them to say, I am going to utilize this resource. I am not going to attempt suicide. I am not going to kill myself. right? You want to get that commitment from that individual. And remember, because all the efforts to persuade someone to live instead of attempt suicide will be met with relief and agreement, we should never hesitate to get involved, right? I want you to put yourself in those shoes. Maybe you've been in a dark position before. Maybe you have lost hope at some point. Imagine if someone was willing to walk with you through that process. There's only agreement. There's only relief that can come with that. And so if we're in a position to do that for someone else, we never want to hesitate to get involved. So what are some encouraging things that we can do? Again, we're talking about referring, right? And we talked about earlier how not to ask the question. Here are some ways that we can encourage someone who may be thinking about suicide. Maybe we can say, hey, I want you to live. I'm on your side. Here's that we again. We'll get through this. Not you'll get through this. We'll get through this. It changes the entire dynamic. Anyone want to share some other encouraging words that maybe we can share with someone who's thinking about ending their life? You can either share in the chat or you can come off of mute. You can go ahead, Cass.
In some cases, just expressing the word love.
So good. So good. I was actually having a conversation the other day. I can't remember who it was with. And we were talking about that word love. And the individual was saying how it's so important to recognize that love goes beyond just a feeling or an emotion. Love is, how they were defining it was, love is an action. Love, when you love someone, it comes out through your actions, not only through what you say or how you feel. And I think that's so important. Thanks for sharing. I see in the chat saying things like, you're not alone. You can come to me anytime. Your story isn't over. Oh man, I love that one so much. Your story isn't over. How often do we go through adversities and challenges through our lives and we think to ourselves, is this ever going to end? Right? And for someone who is thinking about suicide, they think that's it. They think it's over. They think they have to now accept this reality. This is what their life is going to be like forever. But the reality is their story is not over, right? So thanks so much for sharing that. I see again in the chat, giving someone your time means a lot. Most of us don't have time for one another nowadays. Absolutely. All right. And sometimes it could be a few minutes, but what makes that time so meaningful is the intentionality behind it, right? Whether it's 5 minutes or 50 minutes, when someone is giving you intentional time and you know that there was thought behind spending time with you, it means so much, regardless of how much time it is, right? And we can all do that. All right, so different ways to share encouragement. It can be through the things that we say. It can be through the things that we do. It can be that check-in text. I know one thing that I do within my support group, my support network, is I'll check in with friends and say, hey, how's your mental health today? You know, scale from 1 to 5, right? How you doing, right? And how often do we get that question, right? Not very often, but it means so much. I remember the first time someone asked me that question, it caught me by surprise, and it really had me thinking, man, how is my mental health today? And I felt that it was so meaningful that I just started using that as well, right? So asking meaningful questions. The other thing in referring is get others involved, right? Ask the person, who else might be able to help us, right? And I talked about earlier establishing a support network, a support team. This is where we tie all of this together. More times than not, there are certain people when they're suicidal, they think to themselves, there's no one who cares. There's no one who loves me. There's no one who would give me the time of day, right? But if we ask very direct questions, we can identify 2 or 3 people, right? What if we ask the question, hey, if there was one person that you can think of who, if they knew that you were really, really, really struggling, they would have a conversation with you. Who's that one person? And we can dig, we can ask, and we can find out who the core individuals are so that we can establish what a support network looks like for this person. Sometimes it's family members, sometimes it's not. Sometimes it's a friend, sometimes it's a brother, right? Maybe it's a blood brother, or I know, in colleges, there are a lot of fraternities, sororities. Maybe it's a brother that's in a fraternity, right? And in a club, a student organization, right? Maybe it's a sister, maybe it's a pastor, a priest, a rabbi, a physician, a therapist, right? Who are these people that if they knew you were struggling, they would stop whatever they're doing to be there for you, right? You want to ask those direct questions. And as you're asking these questions, you want to be writing down these names. Okay, what's their name? Okay, what's their name? And then once we come up with, anything from 2 to 5 to 7 to 10 people, then we now let this individual know, hey, this is our support network. When you're feeling down, this is who you call. And if this person doesn't pick up, this is the person that you call. Because a lot of times, like I mentioned before, when someone is suicidal, they need you to do more. When someone is suicidal, they've lost hope. So it's hard to even determine who is there for them. It's hard to fathom who cares about me. So they may need help to identify those key individuals, right? And then we get other people involved, right? And obviously we want to ensure that this person is okay with having, however much information they'd like to be shared before you just go out and share information about their particular situation. But again, this is a collaborative effort. We're working together to support this individual. A few other things to consider: join a support team, right? So there are multiple nonprofit organizations that exist. There are different clubs at GGC, student organizations. There are different groups that meet, right? And maybe it's important to join one of these groups. I know in terms of national nonprofit organizations, there is NAMI, N-A-M-I, which stands for the National Alliance on Mental Illness. And they have different chapters throughout the country. And these different chapters, they meet whether in person or virtually, and they have support groups. And they just talk. They just come online. These are individuals with different lived experiences around mental health and mental illness. And they just have conversations and they network and they find other people who experience similar challenges than what they've experienced. There's another group, Mental Health America, right, that exists. I believe they have chapters as well. And then there's Active Minds. Maybe you have heard of different mental health clubs. Active Minds is a very dynamic organization. It's a national nonprofit, and they have different chapters throughout the country, right? So Active Minds is another really good student-led club. I see your question in the chat. Can you type in what NAMI means? Yes, I can. So I'm going to put in their URL, nami.org. And then if you go there, you can see everything about the organization and their chapters, their different national chapters. All right, so a couple of other things that we can do: follow up with a visit, a phone call, or a card, whatever way feels comfortable for you, right? Oftentimes what happens is we'll check in with someone that we've recognized they have, clues and warning signs, and then they're doing better for a while. And then we just move on with life. right? But it's so important that if this person was thinking about suicide at any point, it's important to follow up in 3 months, 6 months, 8 months and say, hey, you know, I remember we were having this conversation. You were thinking about taking your life. How are you feeling now? How are things now? Right? And that follow up can mean so much for that individual. And in that follow up, you may learn that, hey, they're doing extremely well. They got support. They were able to work towards getting to a place where they're no longer considering suicide. Or you may also hear in that follow up that they're still struggling, that they still need support, that they still need someone like you who cares, right? But the only way we learn that is through following up. Let the person know you care about them. You care about what they do. You care about what they don't do. And just in showing that care, right, through listening, through love, right, through action, it can save a life. Everyone, if you have traveled on a plane before, you've seen this, the whole oxygen mask principle. And I think it's critically important to make mention of this as well. You must take care of yourself before you can do anything for anyone else. I know oftentimes the individuals who attend these types of trainings, we're the strong friend. We're the ones who our friends, when they're going through a tough time, they come to us, right? But how often are we taking intentional time to ensure that we are doing okay, we are doing well? Because the reality is we can't pour from an empty cup. And to ensure that we are taking care of our mental health is only going to put us in a better position to support our friends, our peers, our loved ones, our family members. So that's important to remember as well. So I want to share a quick feedback form with you all. I see we have a few of you on during the training. If you can either go to this URL or scan the QR code, and I want you to quickly share your thoughts from the training so far before I share a couple of my final points. And it looks like we may end a little bit early today. So you may be able to get to class. And let me know if you have any trouble accessing the survey. I'm going to share it in the chat as well. Okay. Once you get done with the short survey, take your time with it. Once you get done, just go ahead and raise your hand, and that'll let me know that you are all done. Okay, thank you so much for attending, Aaliyah. I hope you enjoy class. Or actually, Aaliyah, I want to send you the resources. Matter of fact, so once we leave, I'll send a follow-up email because everyone here registered for this training. So you'll have the resources. Don't worry about it. I'll send it over to you. Have a great day. Awesome. Thank you. I see your thumbs up. Awesome. Thank you. I see your thumbs up. All right. We got them all. All right. Last few points before we wrap it up. And I'm going to share some resources with you that are local and national. But one thing to remember in having this conversation, we can't neglect the fact that there is stigma associated with having these conversations, with mental health conditions, with suicide. As much as we have advanced as a culture, as a society, and now there are influencers talking about their experience, we're seeing celebrities who have taken their lives, right? We know of Robin Williams, Twitch, right? We know of Kate Spade, Anthony Bourdain, right? We know these individuals who have taken their lives, unfortunately, and it has created conversations within the media. But the reality is there's still shame associated with it. There's still fear, right? There's a difference between self-stigma and social stigma. Self-stigma is the shame that we feel if we're dealing with a mental health condition. Social stigma is the shame that we experience when others are experiencing a mental health condition. So as we're having these conversations, it's important to encourage the individual and remind them that asking for help is not a sign of weakness. Asking for help is a sign of strength. When you ask for help, it shows that not only are you self-aware enough to know that you need help, but you are courageous enough to ask for help. And we can't have this conversation unless we start with that. And the more we have these conversations and the more we shift our perception around asking for help, is the more we'll be able to move forward and get the help that we need. With that being said, I want to share these resources with you. One thing I like to share in every training or presentation is it's better to have the resources and not need them than to need the resources and not have them. So I talked about some of these resources throughout the training already, but I didn't mention yet some of the local resources that you all have. So they are on this slide. So GGC has a counseling and psychological services center. It's iBuilding Suite 1101. Here's the number that you can call, the email that you can reach out to, and you can schedule virtual and in-person appointments. There's also Be Well at GGC. It's 24/7, 365. It's a support line. So you want to know these resources. The Domestic Violence Crisis Line, that's in Gwinnett County, right? And then the last few are national resources. So please take a picture of these resources. Save it on your phone. You never know when you need them, whether it's for yourself or for someone that you have a conversation with. And you never want to be in a position where you need them and you don't have them, right? So you want to have these. I'm also going to send a post training email with additional resources so that you'll have them on hand with you, at least digitally, if you ever need to access those. Because again, we need to know what's out there. We need to have these conversations. And when we have these conversations, we need to be equipped with the resources to refer individuals to support services. Also, last but not least, this event is sponsored by the GGC Counseling and Psychological Services Center. I am Abraham Scully, founder of Speaks to Inspire. We're a mental health consulting agency, and we do trainings just like this, different presentations just like this throughout the country for colleges and universities. We are on all social media platforms, so feel free if you'd like to continue to engage in this type of content, if you'd like to continue to learn, you can follow us on these different social media platforms. With that, I am going to hit stop record, and we are going to open up if there are any questions.